the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. The ferry capsized and sank in Haifa Bay off the coast of Israel. Rescue and research operations continued through the night and into the daylight hours. At least 2 sailors are confirmed dead, 15 are unaccounted for, 83 have been rescued. Of those, at least 6 have been hospitalized in Haifa. 27 others have been admitted for treatment, and 21 have been treated and released. One sailor talked about the ordeal.
Well, the ship capsized and it flooded. I got a little drowned in the water a little bit. I can't remember. All I remember is that I got throwing up, sick.
The ferry was chartered by the U.S. Navy from a private Israeli company off Israel. The sailors are stationed aboard the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. They were returning from shore leave during the night when the boat capsized and sank. 2 are confirmed dead, 15 are still missing, 6 have been hospitalized, 27 admitted to the hospital for treatment, and 21 paid for 15 American sailors missing after a ferry capsized in the Mediterranean. The ferry was carrying more than 100 sailors back from shore leave to the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. The ferry capsized and sank in Haifa Bay off the coast of Israel. Rescue and research operations continued through the night and into the daylight hours. At least 2 sailors are confirmed dead, 15 are unaccounted for, 83 have been rescued. Of those, at least 6 have been hospitalized in Haifa. 27 others have been admitted for treatment, and 21 have been treated and released. One sailor talked about the ordeal.
Well, the ship capsized and it flooded. I got a little drowned in the water a little bit. I can't remember. All I remember is that I got throwing up, sick.
The ferry was chartered by the U.S. Navy from a private Israeli company. American troops in Saudi Arabia are hearing from the top brass, and 21 others treated and released. The legacy of the Cold War between...
Horrendous weather scuttles holiday travel plans all across the United States. We'll take a look at where you can...
Hello, I'm Charles Crawford at the CNN Center in Atlanta with a brief look at the news. At least 17 American sailors are dead after a ferry capsized off the coast of Israel. About 100 American servicemen were returning from shore leave aboard the rented boat. The ferry overturned just before it reached the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. Rescue crews searched through the night using flares and spotlights. They pulled dozens of sailors from the water. Many were taken to hospital.
U.S. sailors capsizes in heavy seas. And the U.S. Defense Secretary says the likelihood of war with Iraq is growing.
This is Daybreak Saturday with Patrick Greenlaw from the CNN Center in Atlanta.
Good Saturday morning, everyone, and welcome. Here is the latest. Divers have recovered at least 17 bodies from a sunken ferry boat in Israel. All the victims are believed to be U.S. sailors. The ferry sank last night in Haifa Bay in northern Israel. CNN's Linda Scherzer has the story.
Flares lit the harbor of Haifa as rescue teams desperately searched the waters for the missing soldiers of the USS Saratoga. More than 100 sailors on shore leave in Haifa, Israel, were on a ferry heading back to the Saratoga when the ferry capsized just 200 yards from the ship. One sailor describes what happened.
The ship capsized and it flooded. I got a little drowned in the water a little bit. I can't remember. All I remember is that I got throwing up, sick.
83 men were pulled from the icy waters by U.S.
From the CNN Center,
It says 4 are hospitalized in serious condition right now. The accident happened in rough seas in the bay at Haifa in northern Israel. One of the survivors described his experience.
Well, the ship capsized and it flooded. I got a little drowned in the water a little bit. I can't remember. All I remember is that I got...
At least 19 U.S. sailors die as a ferry boat sinks in Israel. The U.S. Secretary of Defense warns that the likelihood of war is increasing in the Persian Gulf. And winter's first big weekend brings widespread bad weather.
this is Daybreak Saturday with Patrick Greenlaw from the CNN Center in Atlanta.
Good Saturday morning. Welcome. Here is the latest. A U.S. chartered ferry boat capsized in heavy seas off the coast of Israel last night. Israeli sources say 19 American sailors are dead. CNN's Linda Scherzer is on the line from Haifa right now with the very latest. Linda?
Well, Patrick, we've just come from an impromptu press conference with U.S. Ambassador William Brown here at the Haifa port. He has just confirmed that the bodies of 20 sailors from the USS Saratoga have been pulled from the bay in Haifa. We're still waiting for a formal briefing from the Navy commander, but here is some additional information that we know. The sailors, all 100 sailors who were on that ferry, were, we are told, only about 2 minutes from disembarking from the craft when it capsized. The sea, of course, was choppy. There were very high winds. We're told that it took all of 15 seconds for the ferry to sink completely. Within 15 minutes of the incident, Israeli Navy boats and helicopters were dispatched. Israeli Navy divers arrived to pull the bodies out from the sunken ferry. The defense minister, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Aarons, arrived here at the port just a few short minutes ago. He had already visited the sailors who were still in hospitals, and here at the port, he met with U.S. Ambassador Brown. The ambassador expressed deep appreciation for all the work and the help that the Israeli Navy did. Quoting the ambassador now, he said, it's at this crisis that we find out who our real friends are. Now, I can tell you that a task force has been set up to investigate this incident, a task force that will be headed by Admiral Nicholas Gee of the 6th Fleet. At this point, Navy divers are still continuing their search through the waters in the bay. Again, there are 20 confirmed deaths. 20 American sailors have lost their lives in this incident. Patrick?
Linda, you say the divers are still searching. Any idea of what they're anticipating as far as a final toll, as far as the number of people that were on the ferry going back to the aircraft carrier? How many are still missing at this point?
Well, Patrick, nobody is saying whether everybody is accounted for. A little while ago, the Haifa police told us that they didn't expect to find any more sailors in that sunken ferry, but the divers are continuing their search just to verify that. At this point, that's about all we know. I can tell you that there are at least a couple of hundred of sailors who are waiting to go back out to the USS Saratoga. Of course, everyone is checking lists just to see who is out there, who is unaccounted for, who may still be missing.
Okay, Linda Scherzer, thank you very much, reporting live from Haifa, Israel, and of course, she will keep us updated as the search continues, and we will have the very latest. Now, of course, the Defense Department has started an investigation of the ferry boat accident, and CNN's military affairs correspondent Wolf Blitzer has been talking with some officials at the Pentagon, and he joins us live right now with the very latest. Wolf, good morning.
Good morning, Patrick. Here at the Pentagon, Navy officials say they have started notifying next of kin from some of the sailors whose identifications, the bodies, have been formally identified. They say this is a difficult process. So far, according to Navy officials here in Washington, they have identified 10 remains, but 9 or 10 others, depending on what the total count is, have not yet been identified formally, and as a result, that process continues. There was a second ferry, apparently bringing some returning sailors back to the Saratoga from Haifa that was right nearby, and the investigation is focusing in on eyewitness accounts, interviewing sailors, trying to determine exactly what happened, why this ferry, this privately chartered ferry, capsized. There are two speculations, two indications. One, that it could have been a structural problem aboard the ferry. The second was that it may have been too heavy. The officials say that the waves were only 3 or 4 feet, and they do not believe that weather was necessarily a factor. Meantime, they say the search and rescue operation is still continuing. They say there's clearly a lag between some of the information being released in Israel, in Haifa, by Israeli police and U.S. authorities on the scene, and here at the Pentagon. The Israeli police have said that 19 bodies have been recovered, but as we just heard from Linda Scherzer, the U.S. ambassador now says that 20 bodies have been recovered. The Navy says that family members of the Saratoga crew can call a special number, 1-800-255-3808. That's 1-800-255-3808 for additional information. They caution, however, that some of the information may not be up to the minute because it still takes time for the official bureaucraties to get to Washington from the scene in Haifa. They say that Navy personnel manning those numbers are trying to release as much information as possible, but some family members may be disappointed in not getting all of the specific information. In the meantime, Pentagon officials say that the Saratoga will be still very much involved in Operation Desert Shield. It had been scheduled to be in Haifa for a few days of badly needed R&R, rest and relaxation, for the sailors, and was going to resume its activities in the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea within the coming days shortly after Christmas. But unfortunately, this has turned out to be a rather serious tragedy for the U.S. Navy and for the personnel aboard the Saratoga. Wolf Blitzer, CNN Live at the Pentagon.
Wolf, just clarify for us, if you would, then this was a privately chartered ferry boat by the U.S. government. Now, some of the initial reports I'm sure that you saw on the wire services said that these sailors were on liberty and were returning to the ship. But, I mean, this was not something that a bunch of GIs got together and chartered the boat themselves. It was chartered by the U.S. government. Is that correct?
That's correct, Patrick. The U.S. Navy chartered these ferries to bring the sailors to and from Haifa, and it was not a formal Liberty launch, part of the actual carrier battle group that's now in the port of Haifa. It was a private charter from an Israeli company.
Okay, Wolf Blitzer, thank you very much. Reporting live from the Pentagon. He will keep us updated throughout the day here on... Good morning, everyone. I'm Patrick Greenlaw at the CNN Center in Atlanta with the latest news update. 20 people, many thought to be U.S. Navy sailors, are dead. They drowned after a ferry boat accident in the anchorage off the coast of Haifa, Israel last night. The boat was carrying over...
City, things are, as you might expect at 2 in the morning, quiet. But as you said, it was a day of celebration, a day of joy, as Kuwaitis turned out by the thousands to welcome in their own troops, Saudi troops, U.S. troops, various allied forces that came rolling into the city. But it didn't come until the last of the fighting around the city was wrapped up, and that was out at the Kuwait City International Airport. Marines out there tangled with Iraqi forces. We're understood that the fight went on for several hours. It did turn into a tank battle, but when it ended, most of the Iraqi troops were either killed or surrendered, and the international airport here was safely in U.S. Marine hands. Strangely enough, after that, the Marines raced to the U.S. Embassy in downtown Kuwait with the U.S. flag. There had been kind of a contest on to see who would be the first to raise the flag among the Marines at the U.S. Embassy in downtown Kuwait City. They arrived and found that the Stars and Stripes were still flying from the flagpole. We went into the U.S. Embassy this morning and were surprised to discover that apparently the embassy had not even been entered by Iraqi forces. There were about 24 large U.S.-made cars there with full tanks of gas, no signs of vandalism, no broken windows, in stark contrast to many of the other buildings in the city, both official and private, that had been looted and pillaged allegedly by Iraqi forces during their 7-month occupation. But the end of that 7-month occupation brought people out into the streets by the thousands. We'll listen now and see the sights and sounds of that celebration as it went on earlier today. But now that the celebration's over, the real work of rebuilding the country begins, and that will take quite a while considering the amount of damage that's been done. There's also quite a bit of concern here about the thousands of Kuwaitis that the Kuwaiti resistance claims were taken by the Iraqis and hauled north with them. These alleged hostages were supposedly going to be used as human shields. There's a lot of concern here about them and a lot of concern about how long it will take to rebuild this country's infrastructure, an infrastructure that was pretty well sabotaged by the occupying army here. Charles Jaco, CNN, reporting live from Kuwait City.
Charles, thank you. When our coverage continues, a report on the tens of thousands of Iraqi POWs.
Orders here at the Pentagon that basically the fighting is now winding down. There is only some scattered combat, not much ground activity right now. The U.S. and Allied airstrikes are basically slowing down as well. We are told that there was a major tank battle near the Euphrates Valley, a tank battle involving U.S. and Allied troops opposing the Republican Guard. In that tank battle, which is now described as over, 200 Iraqi tanks are believed to have been destroyed, 50 armored personnel carriers, 20 artillery pieces. U.S. Army Apache helicopters came in with close air support. The fighting now looks like it's basically over. There could be some more scattered resistance, but the Republican Guard's command and control capabilities appear to have been destroyed. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, reporting live from the Pentagon.
Thank you, Wolf. And from the military arena to the diplomatic one, the United Nations Security Council is calling on Iraq.
But it is a time of pride. Pride in our troops, pride in the friends who stood with us in the crisis, pride in our nation and the people whose strength and resolve made victory quick, decisive, and just. And soon, we will open wide our arms to welcome back home to America our magnificent fighting forces. No one country can claim this victory as its own. It was not only a victory for Kuwait, but a victory for all the coalition partners. This is a victory for the United Nations, for all mankind, for the rule of law, and for what is right. After consulting with Secretary of Defense Cheney, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Powell, and our coalition partners, I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations. It is up to Iraq whether this suspension on the part of the coalition becomes a permanent ceasefire. Coalition political and military terms for a formal ceasefire include the following requirements. Iraq must release immediately all coalition prisoners of war, third country nationals, and the remains of all who have fallen. Iraq must release all Kuwaiti detainees. Iraq also must inform Kuwaiti authorities of the location and nature of all land and sea mines. Iraq must comply fully with all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. This includes a rescinding of Iraq's August decision to annex Kuwait and acceptance in principle of Iraq's responsibility to pay compensation for the loss, damage, and injury its aggression has caused. The coalition calls upon the Iraqi government to designate military commanders to meet within 48 hours with their coalition counterparts at a place in the theater of operations to be specified to arrange for military aspects of the ceasefire. Further, I have asked Secretary of State Baker to request that the United Nations Security Council meet to formulate the necessary arrangements for this war to be ended. This suspension of offensive combat operations is contingent upon Iraq's not firing upon any coalition forces and not launching Scud missiles against any other country. If Iraq violates these terms, coalition forces will be free to resume military operations. At every opportunity, I have said to the people of Iraq that our quarrel was not with them, but instead with their leadership, and above all with Saddam Hussein. This remains the case. You, the people of Iraq, are not our enemy. We do not seek your destruction. We have treated your POWs with kindness. Coalition forces fought this war only as a last resort and look forward to the day when Iraq is led by people prepared to live in peace with their neighbors. We must now begin to look beyond victory in war. We must meet the challenge of securing the peace. In the future, as before, we will consult with our coalition partners. We've already done a good deal of thinking and planning for the post-war period, and Secretary Baker has already begun to consult with our coalition partners on the region's challenges. There can be and will be no solely American answer to all these challenges, but we can assist and support the countries of the region and be a catalyst for peace. In this spirit, as Secretary Baker will go to the region next week to begin a new round of consultations. This war is now behind us. Ahead of us is the difficult task of securing a potentially historic peace. Tonight, though, let us be proud of what we have accomplished. Let us give thanks to those who risked their lives. Let us never forget those who gave their lives. May God bless our valiant military forces and their families, and let us all remember them in our prayers. Good night, and may God bless the United States of America.
Many people around the world listened to the President's address tonight from the Oval Office. We began by going to our World Affairs correspondent, Ralph Begleiter, at the State Department. Ralph, the Secretary is going to be a very busy official.
Well, the President indicated what the next steps will be now after the military leaders figure out how they're going to end the fighting in the Gulf, that is by having a meeting at a designated place in the region. The President said Secretary of State Baker would call a meeting of the United Nations Security Council to formalize the arrangements between Iraq and the coalition which has fought on behalf of the UN Security Council. The President also said Secretary Baker would begin with a trip next week to the Middle East region, presumably to thrust forward on the planning for the post-war situation, and that would include a number of things, including how to prevent Iraq from doing this sort of thing again and arranging a new security regime in the Persian Gulf, but also how to go about an arms control regime in the entire region to prevent not only chemical and biological and perhaps nuclear weapons from being stockpiled and used, but also a reduction in conventional forces in the Middle East. The Secretary of State is also expected to explore how much the Arab members of the coalition are willing to engage now with Israel, which has been a willing cooperator in the coalition, even though it has not been a combatant. And finally, how to go about arranging for some kind of economic cooperation throughout the region to prevent a kind of have and have not situation among the Arabs, which was part of the reason that this entire situation developed in the first place. The President also said that in addition to the ceasefire, he said the United States was going to demand of Iraq the fulfillment of two of the objectives which the President outlined. The President said all of the military objectives had been met, but in fact two of them that he outlined last week had not. One of them was the exchange of prisoners of war and detainees, and the other was the uncovering of land and sea mines. He announced tonight that those would still be conditions that Iraq would have to comply with. Bernie?
Ralph, would you expect that out of all these demands that they very well could create much discussion, much disagreement within the Revolutionary Command Council in Baghdad?
I'm sure there's already been a lot of discussion and perhaps some disagreement in that command council. I must say that it would be fascinating to hear the story that Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister, will have to tell, if he is able ever to tell the entire story of how the unfolding of this situation came about. Aziz, remember, is a well-respected international diplomat who has represented Iraq on many occasions. Secretary Baker has met with him before the war and came out saying he's a good diplomat with a bad brief. it'll be fascinating to see how he and perhaps others were able to persuade Saddam Hussein to bring this thing to an end.
It certainly will be. Ralph Begleiter reporting live from the State Department. Now, let's go to the Gulf area. Correspondent Greg Lamont is in Saudi Arabia. Greg?
Well, Bernie, it's a little tough to get instant reaction. It's only about 10 minutes after 5 o'clock in the morning here in Saudi Arabia, but I have been able to speak with several Kuwaitis and Saudis prior to the president's address in anticipation. The Kuwaitis say that whatever the president is feeling, they too are feeling. If the president is upbeat about the situation with the war, then they are upbeat about it, and they were listening carefully for anything that might indicate otherwise. We heard the president tonight very upbeat, and the Kuwaitis say they will follow along with President Bush and his feelings. This is not something, however, that the Kuwaitis were not unprepared for. They've been planning for this day, their Liberation Day. Kuwaitis have been planning to return. They have been taking applications for anyone that has anything to do with rebuilding a nation, including construction engineers, oil people, doctors, construction again, and those specifically in the oil industry, considering what we've seen in terms of oil fields burning. Every position that would entail rebuilding a country, they are interested in, and they've been taking applications for it in anticipation of this day. Though many Kuwaitis I have talked with also seem to indicate from the video that they've been seeing on television that Kuwait City is not as badly damaged as they had feared. Obviously, had war broken out in the city of Kuwait, it would have been heavily damaged. That is not the case, however, and they are feeling great relief from that. From Saudis that I've talked with, they seem to indicate pretty much the same thing that the Kuwaitis do. Whatever the president feels, they will feel as well. Many have said that they wish that Saddam Hussein was pushed out of power. We'll see what happens with that. Others have said that they wish Saddam Hussein had died. That is obviously not the case. But they also say that they are prepared to help Kuwait rebuild its city. And as far as U.S. troops here, the one analogy that comes to mind is the Rocky movie, the first one. Here is Rocky, who focuses in on the mission ahead of him, much as the U.S. and Allied troops did in this war. Stayed focused, went through the battle, and came out victorious. The first thing that came into Rocky's mind after winning was his wife, Adrian. Well, I can tell you that that's what everyone here is talking about, the folks that I've talked with. Now their concentration is on going home. Greg Lamont, reporting live from Saudi Arabia.
In Jerusalem, where she has been throughout this ordeal, CNN's Linda Scherzer. Linda, what were the Israelis looking for in the president's address? What's the expected reaction where you are?
Well, Bernie, this is an earthquake with major implications for the state of Israel, an earthquake that will not entirely be felt for several hours until the Israelis wake up, and we are trying to wake up their leaders to get you official reaction at this point. But we can tell you that there will be very mixed reactions on the street, the overwhelming feeling relief, if this means that Israelis can unseal their rooms and remove their gas masks, essentially to resume their normal lives. Their leaders will have to be taking a much more cautious view of things. They have said all along that the threat to Israel would not completely be erased until the Iraqi army was not just destroyed, but Saddam Hussein was removed from power. The Israelis have believed all along that the president understood the importance of soundly defeating that army, even if the removal of Saddam Hussein was not an express goal of the United States. But the question remains that can the Israelis live with a situation where Saddam Hussein is still in power? We have asked them that in the days prior to this announcement. They have not said what they would do if the war ended with Saddam Hussein in power. That is certainly something that they will have to consider in the days ahead, whether those missile launchers still pose a threat to Israel. Those are questions that we will be asking, and we will be expecting answers to in the hours ahead. Bernie?
And of course, Linda, apparently the president was anticipating concerns in Jerusalem and elsewhere when he said that the suspension of offensive operations is contingent upon Saddam Hussein not firing either at the coalition forces or Saddam Hussein not launching any Scud missiles on